Hey, it's Conrad Thompson, and you're listening to 83 Weeks with Eric Bischoff. Eric, what's going on, man? How are you?
I'm good. Just busy as hell and spinning plates, flaming plates, but spinning them nonetheless. I'm good. Just busy as hell. Whoa. Spinning plates, flaming plates. I'm getting some weird feedback, guys.
Yeah, we all hear it. I'm not sure what's going on. Silva, you got any suggestions here, bud? Maybe not. Well, we appreciate you joining us. Sorry, we've got some technical difficulties. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Guy Evans is with us. Guy, how are you, man?
I'm doing great, Conrad. Great to be with you guys again. Thanks for the invite.
Oh, we're excited to be here with you. We're going to be talking about WCW video games and licensing. We meant to get to this last week, but there was so much news. I wasn't sure that we could actually get there. I do briefly want to touch on a couple of pieces of news with you, Eric, before we jump into our topic today. I'm sure you have at least heard. I don't know that you had a chance to see, but as we're recording, we're live on a Wednesday. And just last night, TMZ did a tribute for Hulk Hogan. Eric, have you had a chance to see that yet?
I saw clips of it this morning. Actually, I haven't sat down and watched the whole thing, but I saw certain clips, particularly those from Vince McMahon.
And what was your reaction? What did you think?
Overall, I was really glad to hear it. I think it was honest. I think it was sincere, meaning I think Vince shared his genuine feelings. Look, there was and I talked about this, on our tribute show, a couple days after he died, Hulk died. They had a very unique relationship and a complicated one, but Hulk really respected Vince, and regardless of whatever issues they may or may not have had throughout their rather roller coaster ride of a relationship, it was nonetheless a close relationship. And I was appreciative of the comments that Vince made on social media shortly after Hulk passed. And I think overall was very happy with the comments that he made. The one that stood out to me, and I think is the most honest reaction that I've heard from almost anybody, is that, Hulk said racist things, but he wasn't a racist. And I think if people really think about it, that probably applies to a lot of us at different times in our lives and in different situations. So I for one, was happy to see those comments, and I don't want to say impressed, but for lack of a better term, impressed.
It was pretty rare that we got to see a public sighting of Vince McMahon. I'm not here to say that he hasn't appeared at basketball games or things like that, but the idea that he sat down for an interview, I don't think any of that has happened for him in a long, long time. I think it's only fitting, Eric, that if he's going to break some sort of policy, if he had such a policy, that he did it for his late friend Terry Bollea. That was pretty neat of Vince to do, I thought.
Yeah, I did too. And I'm sure it was, Vince, coming to the services. I'm sure that was not without a certain amount of anxiety and probably wondering how he would be received and what people would think of that. But he did it nonetheless, and I think he did a great job. Look, people can say whatever they want because everybody's got their opinions and everybody loves to hate on social media. Vince has got his own issues and he's dealing with them however he's dealing with them. But no one can deny that the combination of Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon has created the industry that so many people enjoy a great benefit from today and enjoy as consumers today. It started with those two men, and I don't think there would have been a Hulk Hogan without a Vince McMahon, and I don't think there would have been a WWE as we see it today without a Hulk Hogan. So I think it was more than appropriate to hear from Vince, both in his social media posts, at the services, and obviously on the special last night.
We got to talk about the big news this week from a business front, Eric. I'm sure you saw the UFC is now exiting the pay-per-view business. For a lot of people, this feels like the end of an era. We've learned that they're going to be exclusively on Paramount in 2026. So there are going to be CBS events, obviously a lot of CBS promotion for Paramount Plus and UFC being on Paramount Plus. They're describing it as a 1.1 average annual value for 7 years. So TKO was able to announce a $7.7 billion deal, just about a week removed from WWE announcing their move to ESPN for 1.1. The stock went crazy. I think it was up $22 that same day. So 2 big mega deals for TKO. But I am curious your take on what feels like the end of an era. Pay-per-view, no more with UFC. Eric, what do you think?
I read a comment that Dana White made, and I think he said something, I'm paraphrasing it obviously, that pay-per-view isn't necessarily dead, in Dana's opinion, if I read the quote correctly. But there are other ways to maximize and monetize your content. I think we'll probably continue to see pay-per-view events. I don't think it's dead, but I think when you get to the level of UFC or WWE and the volume, just the sheer number of large events that they have, the PLE format and a streaming format makes much more sense.
It's going to be interesting to see how all of this shakes out. It's a bannered week for TKO, that's for certain. The other news that wrestling fans these days want to hear about, Eric, is Karrion Kross and Scarlett. It looks like their contracts came up just a few days ago as we're recording. And I know earlier today, as we are sitting down on a Wednesday afternoon, he was live on Ariel Helwani, the guy we know as Karrion Kross in WWE land. And he revealed that he did get a contract offer. But he was only given 24 hours to make a decision. It was positioned like, his offer was just for him. And once they got that under control, they would figure out what was next for Scarlett. And I guess that led to some frustration, but it looks like what a lot of people thought was a quote unquote work. And I thought it might be a Brian Pillman type thing, like we saw years ago with the loose cannon. Maybe it's not. Have you had a chance to keep up with this story? And what do you make of it, heads or tails?
I was literally reading the latest story and some of the comments from the RL interview 20 minutes before I turned on my equipment here to do this podcast. I've always liked Karrion Kross as a performer, as a talent, and I also like him as a person. We've gotten to know each other just a little bit, not close. A ton of respect for him. In a lot of ways. I, like you, in fact, you're the one that, put that Brian Pillman kind of strategy in my head. And I got really excited about that because it would have been a great story. I'm disappointed. I'm disappointed for Karrion, obviously, and for the wrestling fans who obviously had an appetite and wanted to see more of Karrion. I'm hoping that it works itself out. I get a little uncomfortable when I see talent. I don't want to say burning bridges, but when you start talking about contract negotiations publicly, it doesn't really serve you all that well. It may feel good in the moment, and you may be releasing some, frustration and maybe some resentment. And I understand that. I'm a fairly emotional person myself, and I tend to say stupid shit sometimes. But his career isn't over. WWE is the most important place to be right now. It's the biggest opportunity, I should say, not most important, but the biggest opportunity out there. And if I was Karrion's agent, I would just advise him to keep his conversations about his contract negotiations to himself and go out and continue to prove why WWE made a mistake, because sometimes they do. We've seen it in the past, haven't we? And I think if Karrion just does the right thing and keeps being Karrion Kross and stays committed, stays focused, and goes out and makes some noise outside of WWE, he'll be back. But it'll be a lot easier for him to come back if he wasn't, spilling the beans on contract negotiations. It doesn't serve anybody.
It is interesting. I'm seeing a lot of comparisons online to situations for the past. None of them are very complimentary, but I sort of suggested when we were talking about this earlier in the week that I feel like he got an offer and they were far apart on money. I only felt that way because Mike Johnson reported that he did get an offer early last week. And then Karrion today in his interview with Ariel Helwani said, yeah, he got an offer, he believes, on Tuesday, but he was expected to have an answer by Wednesday. And I guess he wasn't happy with the number and needed more time to beat it up. And clearly WWE felt like they had all the leverage. And as a result, it feels like we're in an impasse. I do think eventually he winds up back in WWE or WWE adjacent, Eric, whether that's, the GCW ID program, or that's TNA with Anthem, or if it's Triple Mania this weekend in Mexico. There's a lot of other stuff outside of the main roster of WWE where, if for whatever reason, I don't know what's going on, but I was kind of surprised based on hearing the chants and seeing the momentum. I mean, even his video from earlier this week has over 800,000 views. People are obviously interested. So it feels like it's an opportunity. It's a question of, where is it an opportunity? Do you think he winds up in WWE, or do you think he winds up somewhere else when it's all said and done?
I mean, look, there's still a chance this could be orchestrated. This could be the opening act of Act 1. Still very possible. I don't think anybody should jump off, the cliff and with the idea in mind that this is absolutely a fact. It certainly appears to be. And actually discussing contract negotiations takes it so much further that it leads me to believe it probably is reality, but it also sets up opening act of Act 1 really well. And if there is any kind of a orchestration to this, I hate to use the word work, I just hate it. I would expect him to see in either Mexico or TNA. I hope he ends up in TNA. TNA's got some shit going on. They're making good moves. Their audience is growing. I said it here a month or two ago. They're one major TV deal away from being the number 2 wrestling promotion in the country, in the world for that matter. And we've read shortly after I made that comment that there's some discussions with A&E. There's some discussions with CW. While neither of those networks are necessarily a TNT or a TBS in terms of their reach and their scope, they're significant. And it's definitely a step in the right direction, certainly compared to what TNA has right now, right? You've got to actually be a digital sleuth to find them if you're just a casual fan. So I'd love to see that, but if I had to bet money, I bet we see him in TNA first.
It'll be interesting to see what happens. I'm sure we'll talk about it. And I can't wait for us to talk about that TNA deal. If I were a betting man, I would bet that they land on CW on Wednesday nights live from the Performance Center. And I think they'll announce that sooner rather than later. But we'll see what happens. Today, our topic is WCW video games and licensing. And boy, do we have an audience on YouTube right now. People are fired up for us to talk about the video games. Eric, what's your favorite WCW video game?
What was it? WCW NWO Revenge?
There you go. Correct answer.
That just because it was like, wow, that's kind of like the brand split, although I didn't know the term brand split back when I was trying to figure out a way to give WCW one show and NWO another show. And that video game was kind of a, digital manifestation of that idea. So that, I guess that's why it's probably my favorite. Full disclosure, I've never played a video game in my life. I think I played Pong when it first came out in 1972 or whatever it was, when you could play it on your TV screen. It's like bing, bing. Yeah, that was the last video game I played, 1972. So I don't have any firsthand knowledge of gameplay, but from a branding perspective and just the way it was promoted and the timing of it, that was a big one for us.
Well, that's why we phoned a friend. We decided to give Guy Evans a shout, and we're going to break him in here on 83 Weeks, because before we talk about NWO Revenge, and we definitely want all of your video game questions, we want to thank Tecovas. Anywhere worth going is worth going in good boots. We want you to find your perfect pair with Tecovas. And if you've ever wondered if you can pull off boots with your personal style, well, you owe it to your feet to pull on a pair of Tecovas. Being confident isn't about being different. It's about being yourself. And Tecovas crafts quality Western boots for everyone, from generational ranchers and lifelong cowboys to guys like me, first-time boot buyers. Every one of Tecovas boots are handcrafted with over 200 meticulous steps for broken-in comfort that comes right out of the box. And now Tecovas offers professional-grade work boots that will bring comfort and timeless style to the job site. Beyond boots, by the way, Tecovas also has a wide selection of men's and women's apparel, bags, and even fine leather goods. Turns out Tecovas even has slip-ons and sandals. Bet you didn't know that. They aren't just boots, but they still bring that Western flair. Whether it's a long day or a big night, your Tecovas are built to last and impress. And there's no compromise between quality and style with Tecovas. That's why my dad loved them so much. I've told the story before. I got my dad his first pair of Tecovas. There's a guy at the office who came to visit us. Dad said, man, I love those boots. They were Tecovas. I hooked him up for his Christmas present or his birthday present on the 16th. He loved them so much. He's like, man, I'm going to get a gray pair next time. Well, I knew what to do. So on the 25th, Dad got the gray pair. Dad's rocking 2 pair of Tecovas. He absolutely loved it. You will too. And they put their money where their mouth is. Tecovas has a best in the West guarantee where you get free returns and exchanges for 30 days. And right now you can get 10% off at tecovas.com/83 weeks when you sign up for email and text. That's 10% off at tecovas.com/83 weeks. That's TECOVAS.com. Tecovas.com/83 weeks. See site for details. Tecovas, point your toes west.
It's cool. The same that ad that you have up right now, it just went off. I have that same pair of boots, and they are I've got a closet full. I was a cowboy boot collector for a period of time, and I've had thousands of dollars of like Lucchese's and all the big names. I had a whole closet full of them. I gave half of them or more to my son Garrett, who wears them every day. But my Tecovas boots are absolutely the favorite boot, my most favorite boot I've ever worn, by a mile, because they're so comfortable.
Go check them out. Tecovas.com/83 weeks. Guy, you've done a lot of investigating into WCW, so I know you're well versed in the video game, and we know that there is a ton of video game fanfare about these wrestling games. It was sort of the golden era of gaming for a lot of people, but it didn't really start that way. I mean, I think the first WCW game is probably not everybody's favorite. That was probably back in the Jim Herd era. What can you tell us about the head start that the WWF had on video games and licensing and things like that, Guy?
Well, I think similar to many other aspects of the business, which you guys have talked about on here innumerable times, this was another area where the WWF certainly had much more of a footprint than WCW historically, which makes it even more interesting when you consider ultimately what happened in this perfect marriage between THQ, who were a video game developer and publisher who incidentally found themselves kind of in a similar situation to WCW just before the agreement was made that they were going to work together, insofar as it had spent a couple of years cutting costs and doing everything they could to try to get back on track and turn a profit, and eventually eked out a profit of about $600,000 in the year of 1995, which, as we know, is when WCW turned a profit as well. And we'll get into that whole story, but it was very fortuitous, I think, for both parties that they kind of met up with each other at that particular time. For full disclosure, I mean, similar to Eric, I must admit that my video game experience is somewhat limited, perhaps not quite as limited, but WCW NWO Revenge would have been sort of right in my wheelhouse at the time as someone who was watching the product, and that really represented, I suppose, to bring it back to the question, just such a giant leap forward, for pro wrestling video games at that time, so much so that I think it spawned an entire new generation of fans. It gave them an entry point to get interested in the product, and gave them a way to, enter this subculture of wrestling, which again I'm sure we'll talk about. But yes, the WWF. This was again certainly another area where, although the games, even at the time and certainly in retrospect, very rudimentary, one-dimensional games that really, if you weren't a wrestling fan, you wouldn't find much value in. But that was another area where the WWF was certainly ahead.
When you think about taking over licensing, Eric, this is something we've talked a little bit about in the past, but licensing had always been for WCW way behind the WWF. What do you attribute that to more? Is it just the the brand identity of the company? Is it because they had Hulk Hogan? Is it something else?
It's all of the above. I think a large part of it, you know, a name that doesn't, everybody knows her name, but she doesn't often get recognition for, you know, pivot points and big strategic decisions. But I think it goes back to Linda McMahon. If you read about Linda and her influence in the early days of WWF, Linda had, based on what I've read, I clearly wasn't there, but based on what I've read, Linda probably had more foresight in the value of intellectual property and what that could mean for the professional wrestling business than anybody, including Vince. I think Linda, in a way, taught Vince the value of intellectual property and how to manage it and how to monetize it, probably more than anybody. And, you know, you go back and you look at the infrastructure of WWE and or WWF at the time, and where the effort was placed, where the investment was made. And clearly the investment in licensing and merchandising, in my opinion, largely due to Linda McMahon's view of the world and where she saw the future, her vision. I think a lot of it started with Linda because she recognized the value of intellectual property. Without intellectual property, you're not in the video game business. You're not really in the merchandising business. You're not really in the licensing business, not to any great extent, not in any meaningful way. You're where WCW was when I first got there. Was there a licensing department? Sure. Was there a budget for it? Of course there was, but it was an afterthought. It was ancillary income and relatively insignificant to that. And there really was nobody, unfortunately, up until probably 97, 98, that really understood licensing and merchandising to the extent that they needed to really generate revenue in a meaningful way.
I know that you had obviously been with the AWA before you tackled the new challenge of WCW. And the AWA, I think, actually had action figures in advance of the WWF having action figures. We know that Vince is going to surround himself with sharp business people, and respectfully, people don't often talk about the end of the AWA run as if Vern was some innovator. They talk about him and paint him as a guy who was hanging on to a bygone era. Why did Vern embrace the Remco action figures? Do you know?
And then I don't know. You know, I never talked to Vern about it, so I don't have any firsthand knowledge to share with you. But I think, you know, looking back and knowing Vern and working with Vern, Vern was much more, in some respects, Vern was stubborn, stuck in the mud, like Bill Watts and so many of the promoters that had so much success in the 60s and the 70s and the very early 80s until Vince decided to change the industry. When it came to the in-ring product, when it came to the way wrestling was presented and protected, Vern was as stubborn and as stuck in a time warp as anybody I've ever known. But Vern was also very entrepreneurial. Vern saw opportunity that other times people didn't see. Unfortunately, he didn't see it with his television product. But I'm going to give you another example. I remember specifically, this isn't necessarily tied to a video game, but this is an example of Vern's entrepreneurial kind of instinct, right? I remember Vern getting very excited about a concept called American Sumo. And Vern's idea was to find NFL football players or, you know, big guys that are, you know, sizable, that look like they could, you know, be effective in sumo. And he wanted to create the American Sumo League. Now, I'm sure people listening to this will scratch their heads and, you know, well, that's a dumb idea. I got news. I know a guy, actually, I don't know him, I know of him, who produced, he didn't call it American Sumo, but essentially Vern's idea a couple of years ago in Philadelphia and sold out 15,000 seats. So Vern had vision and ideas that were very outside of his tendencies towards the in-ring product. So I'm not surprised that Vern saw that opportunity and pursued it, because it's really consistent with what I knew of Vern as he was an entrepreneur.
Let's talk about another fellow who maybe doesn't get enough credit. And I know there's a whole lot of people who are going to be frustrated with me bringing this up. But for all the criticism that Jim Herd got, he did understand licensing. He got WCW their first shoe deal with Ruse. He got an action figures deal with Galoob. He started to have conversations with M&M Mars. He had the Bendy figures with Just Toys. He had board games. He had trading card deals. He had a video game deal with FCI. He had a wrestling buddy style doll with Toy Max. He had London Publishing handling the WCW magazine. He had Big Gulp cups and 7-Eleven. So while Jim Herd may not have been a natural for the wrestling business, Eric, he did implement some licensing stuff that didn't exist previously, right?
He did, and he was very effective at it. Unfortunately, he didn't have the strength. He didn't have the audience and the brand power behind him, because WCW was such a fledgling organization. It was, like I've said a million times, it was number 2 in the world, but it might as well have been number 222. And it was that way all the way up until 1995, 94, 95. Jim Herd had great vision, saw the opportunity, had the ability to execute on that vision and the opportunities, but unfortunately he just didn't have the audience or the brand behind him to really move the needle, so to speak. But the vision was there, and the ability to execute on it was as well.
Guy, have you, in all your investigative journalism around WCW, have you spent any time looking at any of the licensing deals that Jim Herd put together?
I'm not sure that I have specifically, but just to echo something that Eric said a few minutes ago, I mean, you look at, for example, the year of 1994. If you were to look at the company's income statement for that year, you would see, and this is in, by the way, the most recent book that I just came out with, Beyond Nitro, if people want to get the precise figures. But essentially, the total licensing revenue that was attributed to WCW was somewhere in the region of $250,000 per year. So not a significant part of the overall revenue that they were bringing in. Now, if you read the book, you'll see, we can go into all kinds of nuance as it relates to how much of that was truly being attributed to WCW as a result of its own activities, or was there the likely possibility some of that money was going elsewhere? You can find out the answer in the book. But I say all that to say that up until 95, 96, 97, 98, all of those efforts that you're talking about, while I think still significant and while they should be recognized and talked about, obviously, dwarf in comparison to what happened when the company really caught fire, which, as I'm sure we're going to get into, happened at a very good time for both WCW and its video game partner.
We want to thank Guy for taking time out of his day to join us here today. And I want to encourage you to go check out GuyEvansBooks.com, where you can get 20% off any of the products there with 83 weeks as your promo code. Be sure to use promo code 83 weeks. The first WCW video game that I recall was the regular Nintendo version that came out in 1990. I think it was called WCW Wrestling. We had the Road Warriors on it and their black classic shoulder pads, and I mean, they had a lot of WCW talent in it. Ric Flair, Sting, Lex Luger, Mike Rotundo, the Road Warriors, Dr. Death, Kevin Sullivan, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat, Rick Steiner, Eddie Gilbert, Michael P.S. Hayes. And the final opponent was a masked wrestler named WCW Master. Maybe this is before we knew we were going with the bad idea, known as the Black Scorpion. But what's interesting is this is actually a Japanese game that featured a lot of All Japan and New Japan talent that they're just going to switch out. Like, as I understand it, Lex Luger replaced Antonio Inoki and Ric Flair replaced Giant Baba. And well, you get the idea. I mean, even like Bruiser Brody was replaced by Ricky Steamboat. So this isn't really a WCW game. It's, hey, we're going to put WCW characters in another game but it's better than nothing. You know, the WWF had been around for a while, and Jim Herd got him in the game, literally with that game. But I think what's maybe become more of a cult favorite guy, and you may have seen some of this, was the Game Boy game called WCW The Main Event. This has become a bit of a collector's item. I don't know that that's even on your radar, Eric, but that game right now is on eBay for $799. For $800, you can get the old Game Boy game from WCW. Now, this game didn't come out until, well, some of the talent wasn't even there anymore. Like the Steiner brothers, by the time this game came out, they were actually wrestling for the WWF. I think it's February of '94. So this would have been very early on, but I imagine some of that stuff was already in motion with FCI. I think that was a Jim Herd deal. Were you hands-on at all? Do you remember Garrett ever playing The Main Event on Game Boy, Eric?
No, Garrett didn't. Garrett's like me. He didn't really get into video games. I don't think he ever really has. He certainly played them, and he's far more familiar than I am. But, as a kid growing up, that just wasn't really what he was into. So I don't remember him playing it, but I do. What the cool thing, I was just in Pittsburgh for the Steel City Comic-Con, which, by the way, shout out to everybody associated with Steel City Comic-Con. I've been to several of the Comic-Cons around the country and in Canada, and this one was so incredibly well run. I think it ran like a Rolex, Conrad. You would appreciate it, given your affinity towards Rolexes. But this thing ran so smoothly and flawlessly that it was actually a lot of fun. And one of the things that people bring to these, conventions, or in this case, the Steel City Comic-Con, is they bring certain memorabilia or collectibles. And I'm seeing more and more and more video games that I'm being asked to autograph than just about anything else, really, any other single item, other than probably, action figures. People like to have those signed, because some of them are collector's items. But I'm seeing a lot more games, and I've seen that one in the past as well.
Guy, what do you think of these two early iterations of WCW video games? The first Nintendo game, the first Game Boy game. I think you and I are a similar age. I think a lot of our people in our live chat today, they are too. They grew up with sort of Nintendo being like the first system kids in their neighborhood were really talking about and going crazy about. Did you have friends who played either the Nintendo game or the Game Boy game?
I have to confess, in my case, it was a little bit later with the THQ game specifically, but in investigating, this whole issue and writing about it at length in the new book and talking about the history as we are here, what I really try to do is lean on people who are, experts in this field. And I really learned a lot about this whole evolution that we're talking about. And I think the general sense that I think people who lived through it will know, and people who didn't can sort of take away from this discussion, is that prior to the golden age of wrestling video games, which you mentioned earlier, these games, while popular with wrestling fans and of course sort of small steps forward in the general evolution of the medium, were such that they featured a relatively small number of players. The available sort of move sets and options were very limited compared to what we saw later, and of course they were two-dimensional games, which made that giant step forward to 3D gaming, which happened towards the end of the 90s, towards the end of the decade, ever more impressive. And as you were talking about that and talking about some of those early efforts, Conrad, I wanted to mention what I think is probably sort of the holy grail for people who are really interested in WCW video games, and that is a discovery that was made. I believe the person's name, it's on YouTube, Stephen Reese, I believe, is the person who actually made this discovery back in 2019. And that is a game that was produced right at the beginning of Turner starting what became WCW. The game is called UWC, which is people have surmised rightly stands for Universal Wrestling Corporation, which is the original legal name of WCW, effectively before it became WCW. And there's sort of scarce details about the game, but if you type in Stephen Reese UWC, you'll see that actually he got his hands on sort of a one-of-one beta version of this game that never came out, but featured, you know, some of the key WCW performers from that time, the Stings, the Flairs, the Road Warriors, and so forth. And so if you know, enjoy your history of wrestling video games and haven't heard of that one, it's because, like I said, it never came out, but you can go onto YouTube and find out a lot of interesting stuff about that. So I wanted to throw that in as well.
If you're on YouTube and you want to check that out, the old game footage, you can just search for unreleased NES game UWC for the Nintendo, and there's a full breakdown from Mr. Reese on this game, and it is sort of interesting to see what it looks like. And as a reminder, you know, that game that came out in 94, we're talking about the Game Boy game, the roster was still locked in 92. So it does feel like these are just old licensing deals that they had held over. It's not like these games were released and WCW made any attempt that we know of to change it. It does feel like, hey, if that guy's not been on our roster for a while, we would have the ability to change it, unless it was an older contract and we're just trying to let it, you know, expire. I do want to talk about when we turn the corner, because these games, while they're generally negatively received, we're talking about the main event. The critical acclaim for this was not good. It was a negative review, and it said something like, the fights themselves look weak. The large cartoony sprites lumber towards each other with bored spectators behind them. The fights sound weak too, with thin hit effects. Sort of the same thing for the Super Nintendo version. GamePro gave it a negative review. They were critical of their stiff animation and their mediocre gameplay. They even got like 2 out of 5 on some other reviews. So these are not well received, which doesn't really support more licensing business. I mean, if you've got a game that's not selling well and it's being critically bashed, well, that's not good. It's almost like owning a handgun for self-defense. You know, it comes with serious responsibility. You need it secure, but you also need it accessible when it matters most. And too often that means choosing between locking it away or leaving it out, which means it's vulnerable to kids, guests, or intruders. And that's the problem that Stopbox USA set out to solve. And they nailed it with the Stopbox Pro. It's 100% mechanical, keyless, battery-free lockbox that gives you instant controlled access to your firearm. No electronics, keys, or codes required. That's right. No keys, no codes, no apps, just a patented 5-button locking system that responds to your unique input. It's fast, intuitive, and built for muscle memory. So you're not thinking, you're reacting. And when seconds matter, well, that makes all the difference. And with the Stopbox Pro, you won't have to trade safety for speed or peace of mind for readiness. Your firearm stays secure, but always within reach. Everything with Stopbox, by the way, is sourced here locally. You don't have to worry about tariffs. It's all produced in their American facilities. So that's going to create meaningful jobs and ensure the highest quality. Stopbox Pro is also TSA compliant, so for a limited time only, our listeners are getting a crazy deal on Stopbox. You'll get 15% off your entire order when you use the code 83weeks. And for even better savings, shop their bundles for the best deals on their best-selling products. Check out their bundles and save an exclusive 15% off site-wide when you use the code 83weeks at StopboxUSA.com. Discover a better way to balance security and readiness with Stopbox.
Conrad, before you jump ahead, got to give credit where credit is due. That might have been the smoothest transition into a read that we have ever heard on 83 weeks. I just got to give you props, brother. That was smooth as silk.
It was so smooth, Silva. It took him a few seconds to catch up. Chaos Theory is with us here live. Hey, guys, I don't know if you know this or not, but Guy's book, and maybe Silva has a graphic for the book, it's called Beyond Nitro. That means the television show Nitro. Guy's book is not about the video game named Nitro. We're talking, this is a business podcast by and large. Guy has said he doesn't play video games. Eric has said he doesn't play video games. We're not going to be able to break down what your favorite 8-bit animation is on the show. We're going to talk about how these games were successful or how they weren't successful and how they added to the bottom line or they took away opportunities from WCW. So we're having a high-level business conversation about WCW video games and licensing. If you're looking for us to break out controllers on the Super Nintendo and play for you live, I hate to disappoint you, but we're not going to be doing that today. So I see some people saying, how did Guy write a book about a game he didn't play? The book is about the program on television called Nitro. The video game Nitro was based also on the television show Nitro. So Beyond Nitro is about what happened in WCW. If you've not read Guy's book, you're missing out. I want to give it another plug. Use the promo code 83 weeks. Eric and I believe it is the definitive guide for what really happened in WCW. There's the first book called Nitro and the sequel called Beyond Nitro. Go pick them both up right now. Save yourself some cash. Get 20% off. But you're going to see details that have never existed anywhere else. And lots of other people are spouting his data and his research off. We've got the actual source here who sourced all that material. Eric, am I speaking out of term? Guy's done the heavy lifting that a lot of other journalists in this space have ignored for decades.
No, not only I don't think you can overstate the impact that Guy's book had on the truth about what happened with Nitro, because for 20, 25 years, the narrative has been generated by, in part, WWE, because they like to recreate history to their own liking. And then, parasites like Dave Meltzer, who do no research, really don't study shit, talk a lot about how much they know, but in fact know very, very little. And Guy's book has probably done more to really educate the audience who's interested on the real story behind Nitro, and particularly with Beyond Nitro. He brought receipts. He brought interviews from people that were part of Turner Finance, not WCW. They didn't work for me. They worked for essentially Vicky Miller and Turner Finance. And in it, and in that book, you'll see for yourself the things that I had been talking about for years that everybody thought I was, covering my ass or making excuses or fading the heat to somebody else. There's just facts. And I really hope that Dave Meltzer, who likes to talk about how much he studies, I hope he takes the time to read that book, because he'll learn a lot. And for those of you who don't live on the internet and live off of the internet wrestling community's narrative, which is nothing but garbage, you'll learn a lot. Not only about WCW and Nitro and what happened, but it gives you a pretty good idea of how the world of business really operates. So I owe Guy a lot. He's probably done more to not reshape the narrative, but to really educate the audience on facts and information, as opposed to hyperbole and bullshit. It's for you, Larry.
I appreciate that. Hey, I do want to ask, Guy, when you start really digging in to the business of WCW, Eric has talked about this a lot on the program, that for a pitch person on Madison Avenue to be able to reach out in their briefcase and pull out a picture of Hulk Hogan, it developed some sort of commonality. And we saw this same sort of thing echoed with his passing, that perhaps fans were familiar with the WWF. Maybe they weren't with WCW, but at a point in time, and this sounds crazy with the benefit of hindsight, but this is true at the time, Hulk Hogan had more brand recognition than the actual WWF initials. And if you had Hulk Hogan endorsing your product, well, that went a long way. Do you parrot what Eric has said, that the Hulk Hogan opportunity, when he comes in the WCW, yes, it helped ratings, yes, it helped merch, but licensing may have been the thing that was most affected?
Yeah, so let's connect this to the topic of video games, because as you were saying that, it reminded me of many conversations I had with former THQ employees and video game executives. Who was the person, do you think, that they mentioned when they talked about the WCW opportunity? The first wrestler that came out of their mouth was Hulk Hogan, right? When you would ask them, tell me about these WCW games, tell me about the business behind them, they'd say, well, I'll never forget going to a show and meeting Hulk Hogan. And, they would occasionally mention people like Randy Savage and wrestlers of that ilk. But without fail, the first person was always Hulk Hogan. And, there was a very prominent executive with THQ, which of course were the publisher behind the WCW NWO Revenge and WCW NWO World Tour, among other games. Eventually they got the WWF license. And what she told me is that prior to making the deal with WCW, one of the things that they were doing was engaging in trend spotting. So they were trying to evaluate what properties do we think are out there currently that are going to experience, a significant growth in popularity? And like I said, whether or not that's someone sort of retrospectively trying to make things sound more prepared than they were, I don't know. But for what it's worth, she said that WCW was something that, in 1995 was on their radar as a result of the Hulk Hogan acquisition the year before, as a result of Nitro starting and all of the increased promotion and hype and hoopla behind that. And, according to her, they could sort of foresee this being a property that would be on the rise in the future. So yeah, I suppose if you didn't live through it, if you didn't have sort of a firsthand awareness for it, it's hard to draw an analogy between the sheer name value of Hulk Hogan versus any wrestler today. We're just talking about completely different universes. And I'll just end with this very quickly as well. Eric has mentioned on numerous occasions in the past a guy by the name of Joe Uva, who was a very pivotal executive within that Turner Corporation and went on to become, as Eric has talked about, was and maintained a presence as one of the premier people in the world of advertising. And I remember when I interviewed him and we were talking about this whole time period, and he said, when Hulk Hogan turned bad and Hulk Hogan went to the dark side and he was in all black, he said that really resonated with a lot of people who couldn't get their teeth necessarily into some of the content and some of the programming and some of the storylines, but that was something that everyone understood the significance of. Like, what do you mean Hulk Hogan, the all-American, ultimate babyface, has turned to the dark side after all this time? So in many ways, although if you look at it from a strictly programming standpoint, you would say, okay, Hulk Hogan's matches in the ring, if you've seen one of them, arguably you've probably seen most of them. But his impact, far exceeded that where it really mattered, in the bottom line for WCW.
Eric, we know that you're going to finally get your hands on WCW. You're going to bring in Hulk Hogan in 1994. Very quickly, you have a deal put together with the original San Francisco toy makers. They're going to make these giant WCW action figures. I think that company was actually started by former Galoob executives. But these first version of the WCW action figures on your watch are reminiscent of the old LJN figures we saw in the WWF. But that feels like the first of many licensing deals, because once Nitro launches in the fall of 95, by early 96, that's when you announced the THQ deal. What do you remember about how the THQ deal came together for you guys in WCW, Eric?
Well, it would have come through Sharon Sadello, more than likely. Possibly it may have come in through Mike Weber. Mike worked for Sharon. She was the VP, and I think Mike was a director. But they worked very closely together on those deals. The thing that I remember, because I didn't get involved in the negotiation, I really wasn't hands-on in any of the licensing deals. Clearly, I had approval over some aspects of it when it came to images and which wrestlers we use and things like that. I had to sign off on. But in terms of negotiating the deals, I had no visibility into that. What I do remember, though, is a lot of excitement about THQ, because we had been struggling. Again, we did, much like Jim Herd, when I was running WCW early 92, 93, or 93, early 94, before we got Hulk Hogan, we couldn't get arrested at a licensing convention. I mean, just nobody paid attention to us. THQ was like one of those opportunities that was, gosh, maybe someday we could get here, because it represented growth, and it represented the fact that we were building our licensing strength, and that there was potential growth in that area. And THQ was pivotal to that.
Yeah, THQ is where it really starts to become big business. It's going to hit the business wire, and the headline is THQ and Turner ink a deal to bring World Championship Wrestling to next generation video game systems. So they're talking about Sony PlayStation, Sega Saturn, and the PC CD-ROM. I got a feeling almost everyone who's watching us live here on YouTube, they played on the Sony PlayStation. I know I did. I had a friend who had a Sega Saturn. I had friends who were computer gamers, but I feel like the PlayStation was the console of choice by and large for most characters who were playing at that era. The games were due in 1997, according to this press release that comes out in January of 96. And they're listing, of course, front and center, Hulk Hogan, Macho Man Randy Savage, Ric Flair, Giant, Sting, Lex Luger. From a marketing standpoint, those are all your WCW IP, Eric. I mean, when you start to rattle off all the different characters, it does feel like an opportunity because most video games, I would imagine, they're not going to have as much name value with the individual characters. Maybe there's one central figure and the whole thing's built around him. But in this particular case, man, you can use all of those. It does feel like a big deal for WCW, especially with their new, video game or their new television program lined up on Nitro. But Eric, were the talent excited about this? I say that kind of almost tongue in cheek. I imagine that it's got to be a kick for some of these guys to say, hey, I've got my first action figure. I'm in my first video game. With the excitement you're talking about, how much of that is amongst the boys? Like, hey, we're going to have a game on PlayStation? That feels like a big deal.
That was like the prevailing attitude towards it. Again, it represented growth. It represented success. Talent was reaching a level within their industry that many of them hadn't experienced before. So it was no doubt validation in terms of who they were and where they were in the food chain to be able to have an action figure. And it's the truth to this day. You see, young wrestlers, young performers, they get their first action figure. They're on Twitter, they're on Instagram. They're excited about it. So I think it's still true. It just represents validation. Now, they weren't as excited about it as they were in WWF, because in WWF, talent was paid a percentage of royalties. That was a big part of their check. In WCW, the contracts were structured much differently. And while there was some revenue, there were some royalties associated with licensing, it paled in comparison to what you could get if you were in WWF at the time and you were featured prominently in a video game. So from an ego perspective, I don't know if ego is the right word, but for lack of a better one, from an ego point of view, of course, everybody was excited. Again, validation. But at WWF, it was all of that. You got all that validation and a check. So it was a different kind of energy.
Of course, WCW, the Nitro video game, is a THQ release. It's going to come out in January of 1998. And left to right, you've got Sting looking like the Crow. You've got Hulk Hogan with the double bicep as Hollywood Hogan. And then you've got the Giant on the right. From a marketing perspective, Eric, is this completely up to Turner Home Entertainment? Is it up to THQ? How do they decide who goes on the cover, Eric?
They come to me and we talk, and we try to look into the future. Like, if I know a game is coming out, because it takes a while to develop, produce, and distribute a game. I don't remember what the lead time was, but I think 8 months to a year is probably ballpark at the very least. So when the subject comes up, okay, we've got a deal, we're going to produce this game, who should we include? So you kind of got to go through your contracts and decide, okay, who do I know for sure contractually is going to be here 2 years from now? Because you want to make sure, if you can, that those people featured in the video game are still a part of your active television show, right? Your current show. So you first thing you do, you go through a checklist. Okay, we know who's popular. Let's check the contract. Are we up for renegotiation soon? Is this somebody that we really want to re-sign or can afford in some cases to re-sign? So you go through that process, and then it's just a matter of creative forecasting. Who do we think is going to be the most viable characters on television a year from now? And that's how you make your selection. And it's collaborative. It's not. I didn't make all the decisions. Neither did Sharon Sadello or Mike Weber. It was very collaborative. But at the end of it all, that was our call.
I guess I got my games out of order. In my head, I thought Nitro came out first, but I'm seeing now it was actually WCW versus the World. That actually came out first. That was early 97 before we actually see the Nitro game. But I got to say, I'm kind of like you. You know, I think that most of our listeners who are listening to this, they think of those Nintendo 64 games with the greatest fondness. And we've got some live chats that are coming in here now. And I'm going to ask you some of these questions, Eric. I don't know that you'll know all the answers to these, but we'll hit some. Matt Fisher wants to know, hello, my question is simple. Why was Ric Flair not in WCW NWO Revenge? Until Eric officiates my wedding, make mine 83 weeks. Hey, what do you remember about that? Was that during the contract dispute, do you think?
Quite possibly. I couldn't tell you definitively yes or no, but if he was not included.
It was released in October of 98.
Yeah.
So I think that's probably the time, because I think he returned in September of 98 in Greenville.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the timing is probably based on they weren't sure if contractually he'd even be there, right?
And just to jump in real quick, sorry to cut you off, Eric. And this is covered in the in the book chapter, they were working on that game until the 17th of August. That was actually the last day they were working on the game. So Rick comes back September 14th, right? So I think, you know, that would be our answer for sure. The dispute that was going on, in my view.
You, Guy. No, that makes sense. That absolutely makes sense. And like I say, Guy has the receipts. He's got the dates, he's got the quotes, he's got the interviews. So I'm going with Guy.
Well, you need to go with Guy too. We want to encourage you to go check out his books at guyevansbooks.com. Be sure to use that promo code 83 weeks. You'll get 20% off. Doom Rules is with us here live, and he says, were Sting and Hogan still feuding in 98 and 99? They were. I wondered about Revenge's opening cinematic, which features Hogan and Wolfpack Sting facing off. Also, what was up with the reference to Big Trouble and Little China at the start? I know you probably don't remember these particulars, Eric, but who would have been, besides Mike Weber, who I know was working for marketing for WCW at the time, who else would have been involved in some of these details with regard to the video game? Was there someone on your staff who oversaw it?
No, it was really Mike Weber and Sharon Sadello, probably more Mike than Sharon. And Mike would just interface with whoever he needed to interface with, whether it was me for approval or Kevin Sullivan or whoever was, you know, kind of taking lead on creative at the time, to see where we were going. And when there was new ideas, when there was something that they wanted to do that was outside of, I guess, standard operating procedure for video games, they would come to us and say, hey, we've got an idea. We'd like to do this. How do you feel about it? And again, we'd collaborate. I didn't try to micromanage the process because I didn't know enough about it to micromanage it, right? My approach to the development of the video games and ideas that people had for the video game was, you know, do no harm. You know, first do no harm, kind of like a doctor, you know, don't fuck anything up for me if you can help it in terms of the image of the character or the brand. And then after that, I pretty much let the people that understood how to develop a good game. The worst thing I can do is to insert myself into a process I don't fully understand, because you end up slowing it down and people end up compromising because of you. And oftentimes those compromises are missed opportunities. So I took a little bit of a macro approach to the development of the games, as long as it was consistent. The characters were consistent and the gameplay was consistent with the brand.
Do you remember when Sharon Sadello left WCW?
She was still there when I came back to buy it in 2000.
So she was there till the bitter end, you think?
Yeah, and I remember that because my first meeting actually was Brian Badal, and I came to Turner headquarters, and we had a Wall Street conference call. You know, we had all the leading bankers and reporters and everybody from Wall Street that reports on financial stuff, and we had a conference call announcing the sale. And I remember sitting next to Brian, sitting across the room from Sharon, and I could read her body language like from 3 miles away, right? She was like, oh, I can't believe he's back. That's why I know she was there until the end.
Well, something else you won't believe is that you've waited a long time to get Tushy. If you haven't already, what are you waiting for? Listen, join us in the future, in the revolution of cleanliness. I'm talking to you if you're still messing around with toilet paper. The Tushy bidet is the real deal, and they have the everyday luxury bidet that instantly transforms your bathroom habits and bottom health for life. Cloud Plus is one I'd recommend. It automatically deodorizes the air when you sit down. My wife loves Aura because it automatically opens the seat when you enter the bathroom. You see, Tushy's elevated bidet collection nurtures your bottom with instant warm water that never runs cold, a soothing heated seat, and even UV sterilization for next level hygiene. By the way, all the Tushy bidets easily attach to your existing toilet, so there's no need for additional plumbing. And Tushy is going to pristinely remove 99% of the bacteria while protecting your natural skin barrier thanks to its one natural ingredient. Fresh water, that's it. Installation's fast and easy. It only takes about 10 minutes to complete. Literally anyone can do it. And it's also easy. You sit down, you cleanse, and you can even dry using the built-in dryer. That's right. You can go hands-free in the bathroom now. People who've made the switch to Tushy are reporting using up to 80% less TP. No more clogged toilets. And how about this? Every Hello Tushy bidet comes with a 30-day hassle-free return policy and a 12-month warranty. But trust me, you're going to love it. You're going to order more. Check it out. Keep your swappiest body parts fresh and cool. For a limited time, our listeners can get 10% off their first bidet order when you use the code 83weeks at checkout. We're talking 10% off your first bidet order at hellotushy.com with the promo code 83weeks. Hey, we're talking live with Guy Evans here. If you haven't already, you certainly need to check out Nitro and Beyond Nitro. The video game starts rolling for WCW around the same time that the Monday Night Wars do. I don't think that's by accident. As the audience expands, so does the appetite for licensing. Guy, is that what you saw as well?
Absolutely. And I think one point to that end that I really want to emphasize, because I know there's a huge sentiment behind this, as evidenced by so many people I've heard from over the years since both of these books came out, is once again how important these games were in being a bridge from perhaps someone who was a wrestling fan to another person of the same age, sort of a peer who maybe had some awareness of what was going on. But this was just such an accessible way to get interested in the product, because if you became a fan of the games, naturally that's going to create a compulsion to tune in and see the characters come to life, so to speak. And you know, the N64 games in particular, I think, were just so important when it comes to that. Not only in the United States, but also internationally as well. And a lot of that had to do with, once again, used the word fortuitous a couple of times. One of the things that just worked out better than anyone could have imagined is the fact that THQ partnered with this group of brilliant developers from Japan, Aki Corporation, formerly known as The Man Breeze, which is one of the strangest monikers for a company that I've ever heard of. But by the time we get to this time period that we're talking about, Aki Corporation are the people who developed these games and became, you know, so well known in the video game community for their work, to the extent where even to this day there are efforts to sort of replicate some of the innovations that they brought forth with their sort of groundbreaking engine, which is sort of the underlying principles and rules which govern how the game's played. And there's a project out there, UPW, Ultra Pro Wrestling, that people can look into, which I believe is coming to market shortly. I would talk about it a little bit in the book, really inspired by the feel and the nature of those games. So yes, you're absolutely right. The timing couldn't have been better. It happened really when WCW was at its peak in terms of viewership, and they were able to come out with these just extremely intuitive, highly playable games, which really acted as an entry point for anyone who was interested in getting involved with wrestling and with watching wrestling. And I should also say, just in closing as well on this particular point, and Conrad, you'll know this, as will most people listening to this who are interested. I suspect that one of the reasons why a lot of the content from this time is so indelible and so memorable and has stuck with people for such a long period of time is sort of the nature by which people digested with and got involved with the product back then. And what I mean by that is, let's think about those N64 wrestling titles, okay? Were these games being played primarily in isolation? I mean, of course, that was happening. People were playing them on their own. But in large part, if you were in sort of that teenage adolescent age group, you were playing the games on the weekends with your friends, and you were having all night, you know, title tournaments and battle royals. And of course, with the N64, you could plug in 4 controllers at the time, which was a huge innovation and a huge step forward And so there's so many memories that I think people have that are involved with that. And then, of course, subsequently watching the programs as well, that is kind of hard, to see in the future by virtue of the way that people sort of engage with wrestling, and by proxy the wrestling video games today, sort of a comparable experience, because it was so communal. It was with your friends, it was with your family. And I think that's something that people, I know from all of the emails that I've got over the years, people really cherish those times and associate a lot of positive memories with those N64 games.
Shout out to PJ Taints, who's with us here live, and he says, I still have my 64 and play Mayhem and WCW versus NWO with friends. I think you're onto something, Guy. I mean, that resonated with me when you wrote about that in your book, saying that friends would have sleepovers and they would just, have a spend the night party, as we said here in the South. We would certainly play that game to death. And I do think, as nice or fun as it was to see wrestling get hot and then be represented on the PlayStation, I do think it went to the next level for Nintendo 64. That was always my experience, at least. And I'm seeing a lot of that in the live chat. Speaking of live chat, let's do a few of those. AOTV Productions is with us here live, as always. Appreciate you hanging out with us. And he says, my first wrestling game was WCW Mayhem 1999. The intro with Goldberg is etched in my mind. Man, respectfully, I think you missed out on some great stuff. That is not my favorite game. Guy, what can you tell us about WCW Mayhem?
Well, this brings us on to an interesting point, which actually I'd like to ask Eric about. And we've talked about it, Eric and I, in the past when I was doing the first book, and I know he's mentioned it on this podcast before, but I think for the benefit of people listening, I'd like to ask him in a second about EA, the relationship between WCW and EA and how that came about. But what I will say, to answer your question first, though, Conrad, when I think about that delineation between those THQ games and then EA with WCW Mayhem, WCW Backstage Assault, one of the key differences, which I think even if you don't, if you're not an expert on video games, you can still appreciate, is the fact that those THQ N64 games were being produced before motion capture. And if you remember EA, that was, what did you always see when, you would read about an upcoming EA football game, basketball game, whatever the case may be? You'd always see these pictures of the athletes wearing the apparatus and the equipment and doing the motion capture stuff. That's what EA was known for. In the case of THQ, they were actually, believe it or not, basing the animations from the game on VHS tape footage. So they were looking at the footage of, a suplex or a reversal or whatever the case may be, and an artist was hand drawing that in. And again, could I break down to you exactly mathematically how video games are made? No, I couldn't. That's why I quote people in the book who can. But what I can appreciate is the craftsmanship and the attention to detail and the love that came through in those games for professional wrestling and for the product at that time. And again, I think that's another contributing factor as to why those games are remembered so fondly. And you would think with EA, with their high-tech sort of approach, the games would be received in a much more positive way. But of course, as we know, that's not what happened. But that brings me on, if I could just to throw this to Eric, and I get, again, as I said, we've talked about this in the past, but for the people listening, Eric, because I know a lot of people are interested in that transition, where all of a sudden, the THQ games were doing really well, and then the news comes out that they've lost the license, and WCW are going with EA, which of course was like the big player in the sports game space. Could you sort of break down for the listeners how you remember that sequence of events going?
I can, to a large degree, and I can give you 5 million reasons why we made that decision. Because the CEO of EA, I think it was the CEO or the president at that time, came to an event and presented me with a really cool EA Sports jacket and a facsimile $5 million check representing the advanced against royalties, which was a real high watermark for WCW. I'm sure WWE had done many deals at that level, but again, their licensing and merchandising division was so much more mature than ours, and it had so many years of success previous to us finally cracking through and getting a company like EA Sports interested in us. It was not a, I mean, I can give you 5 million reasons in advance why they did it or why we did it, but it wasn't an easy decision. There were a lot of people that were very committed to THQ. THQ jumped into bed with us at a fairly risky time, business-wise. They saw value, they saw growth, obviously opportunity with Hulk and all that. But still, we were kind of a somewhat emerging brand at that time. And to leave that opportunity and make that big jump was not without debate internally. Mm-hmm. But the decision, and it was one that I made, that's why I remember the debate, was not just the $5 million advance, which was, for me, mind-boggling at the time. We'd be lucky to get $100,000 advances in some cases, or people would be high-fiving themselves and looking for a Christmas bonus over a $50,000 advance. So a $5 million advance represented to me, at least, that our business has reached an entirely new level. But it wasn't easy. There was some debate. There were some unhappy people, particularly at THQ. But it was also the technology and the potential for growth in the business that the technology that EA Sports had, in addition to all of their other big titles. You know, you are who you hang with, so to speak, in life and in business. And for WCW to be in business with EA Sports, even without that big advance, still represented growth. So it was a decision. It was a business decision. It wasn't because of anything THQ did or didn't do. It was because EA Sports represented significant growth in terms of technology and advancement in the gameplay, as well as just their catalog and their marketing and promotion. But it was a tough decision.
As a wrestling fan, let me just say, Eric, it sucked. We like the THQ games much better, but I get why. I want to advocate for you here, Eric. When you talked about, hey, you are who you hang with sort of thing, EA was producing at that time the Madden game, which is number one, NBA Live. They had the MLB license. They had soccer. They had Knockout Kings with Muhammad Ali on there. They had hockey. They had Tiger Woods golf. They had college football. So make no mistake, this is a much bigger brand, and you're going to get to rub shoulders and be featured with all these other licenses. If I was in your seat, Eric, I too would feel like, hey, I can trust the WCW IP with these guys. If it's good enough for the NFL and the NBA and Major League Baseball and NASCAR and it's going to be good enough for WCW. I'm curious, when you did all your research, is it fair to say that the THQ game sold better than the EA game, in your opinion, Guy? I mean, do you have the data on that?
Yeah, I think there's a massive chasm between the two. I mean, we'll take Revenge that we've referenced several times today. That game, according to the most recent reports that we have, sold 1.88 million copies. And I believe up until a certain point in time, it was the highest selling game ever on the N64 made by a third party. So just to put that into context and to kind of tie it together based on what you were just saying there, as you said, EA Sports had this already impressive portfolio of titles, and they were very distributed in terms of the different sports that they were involved in. The WCW games with THQ became so successful that, as per THQ's own financial disclosures, in the first quarter of 1998, WCW titles accounted for 88% of their revenue. So wow. Nearly 90% of their revenue was from the wrestling games, right? Which certainly I don't think anyone anticipated prior to. But I think you made a really good case there in terms of, yes, in retrospect, we can look back, and obviously the EA games are not remembered anywhere near as fondly as those other games. But given the relative position of each company at the time and the financial incentives that Eric talked about, Conrad, I think you made a good case there.
AOTV Production says, I remember EA saying 1999 was the year of the cyber athlete. And lots of people, including ELP 3035, want to talk about the the jump from THQ and the WCW breakup. I even found in our research guy, you mentioned 1998, even in 97, THQ is saying that WCW games accounted for 39% of their total company revenue across the calendar year.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's clear that these guys have put, for lack of a better word, all their baskets, all their eggs into the basket of WCW. Like, they are as invested in this game as they possibly can be. And that's probably the reason we love the game so much. It was so important to them. And respectfully, EA's got Madden money. They've got college football money. They've got all the other licenses. So on some level, it's just another license for them. Now, Eric, I know that's not necessarily something that you're going to be really invested in, because do you want to guess when that game was released, Eric? Do you remember WCW Mayhem being released? Do you remember when?
No.
How about September 23rd, 1999?
That was after I was sent home.
That's just a couple of weeks after you go home. So I'm sure the last thing you're worried about is, how's the video game doing? You know,
I didn't cross my mind. I was more concerned with what the trout were hitting on that particular day based on the grasshopper population. So trout love grasshoppers. And I was fly fishing in Wyoming when that game came out. So that was the farthest thing from my mind.
Eric, did you know? I mean, I feel like Guy brought up a good point earlier, and he talks about this in his book, and he even talked with our friend Evan Husney from Dark Side of the Ring, who we both think a lot of and does a great job with that program. But there was a lot of crossover where video game fans just enjoyed the video game, and it was so fun, they would start watching the program. And Eric, you and I have heard this whenever we go, to do a live show or we have some sort of a convention or whatnot. I will routinely hear from folks who say, man, I hadn't watched wrestling in years. And then I started listening to you and Eric, and now I'm back in. I watched SmackDown last night. Did you know that phenomenon existed with the video game back then? Or are you only learning that after the fact?
I think the truth is I really kind of figured it out after the fact. It's a little bit like we were talking about the Unreal series for WWE and the debate about it. And my position was I would be fully supportive of it. I would do it if somebody came to me, if I was running a wrestling company now and said, hey, I've got this idea. What if we do this? I would jump in with both feet, possibly because what I've learned subsequent to this, which is anyway, whether it's another television program, a video game, a movie, a kind of spin-off television series, animation project, even music, anything that you can produce, distribute, and get the audience to engage with is added value to the brand. You're going to find people that are going to come across your brand that might otherwise not have watched it. And they're going to participate. They're going to engage differently or in addition to other ways that they engage. All of that just continues to bring people and attract audience to your core business.
It is interesting, once you make the EA deal and you sort of laid out why and how it happened, it came with a nice jacket and a $5 million check. The THQ opportunity gets bigger because, well, the WWF's contract with Acclaim was expiring. THQ, who had a lot of great knowledge about how to market to wrestling fans now, and well, a big portion of their revenue was based on a wrestling game. They went to the WWF, and the result is some of the most sought after and celebrated video games in history. THQ just had it dialed in. I'm curious, Eric, was there anybody, as you're having that debate about should we leave THQ and take the guarantee from EA? I know ultimately it was your decision, but were you consulting with any gamers, or was it strictly a business decision? Do you recall if there was anyone on the inner circle who played the game at all?
No, I think everybody on my staff kind of fell into the same bucket I did, and just really didn't have a lot of firsthand knowledge of gameplay or the games themselves. In some cases, their kids did. I'm sure, Mike Weber had kids who were into video games, but Mike himself probably had no more familiarity and probably didn't spend any more time playing games than I did.
Well, I mean, it obviously worked out, Guy. I mean, we know that THQ gets the WWF license. They're going to start printing money with those games. In a weird way, Eric may have accidentally done THQ a favor because they wound up getting the bigger opportunity with the WWE. But it's interesting to think without EA approaching with the $5 million check, it could have changed everything, right, Guy?
That's right. And I know in speaking to many former THQ employees, they really viewed that moment as almost an existential crisis for them as a company, because according to their sort of company law, back when they entered into the agreement initially with WCW, the recollections of THQ executives is such that the company essentially had $1 million cash on hand, and that's what they proffered to WCW to enter that agreement, which started on December 29th, 1995. It was a 3-year deal between WCW and THQ. So when they got the news that obviously the company was going to go in a different direction, they really thought they were done for. Because keep in mind, historically, THQ did not have a reputation of developing quality games, period. Their business model was to acquire a license and then basically find a developer, and I'm speaking in general terms here, I'm sure there's some exceptions, but find a developer who can churn out that game as quickly as possible and bring it to market. And the thinking was, if we can stack up as many of these licenses as we can, there were a number of notable ones, Star Wars, Rugrats, the Nickelodeon show, WCW, of course. But if we can stack up a number of those agreements, then we can be a profitable entity. So they weren't historically known for being a quality video game publisher. That is until the wrestling titles came along. And I want to give you this anecdote, Conrad, to underscore everything that you just talked about there, to how influential these games were, but also how, to your point, the WWF games took it to the next level, right? With WrestleMania 2000 and No Mercy, really building on that formula that they had developed with the WCW titles and expanding on it greatly. After this book came out, I got, and I would love to get your reaction to this, by the way. I got an email from a wrestler who said, well, let me ask you this first, Conrad. Do you recall in these games, and I believe this was innovative for the time, they included something called a spirit meter. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's fairly basic fare for games today, right? But this was like revolutionary at the time. So basically, the more damage that you're doing to the other opponent, the more it affects their spirit meter, right? I got an email from a wrestler who said, I grew up with these games, played them religiously, and when I became a wrestler, the way that I structured my matches is I would visualize in my head and have a concept of like the spirit meter, right? Like how much damage the other opponent had done to me. And that would influence, the way that I would be selling the moves, the way that he would be selling the moves. So what am I saying in a nutshell? What I'm saying is, not only were these games highly influential and so memorable for the people playing the game, but ultimately for that next generation of wrestling performers, the future generation of stars. We talk a lot about, and rightfully so, the influence of the cruiserweights and the lucha libre wrestling and the wrestling from all over the world that really changed the mainstream style of wrestling. But until I got that email, I didn't even consider that the video games also had an impact on the way some of these guys went on to structure their matches. And you can imagine maybe those from a different era looking at the matches and saying, well, this doesn't make any sense. Well, based on their concept of a wrestling match from the video games, it made perfect sense. Do you see what I'm getting at?
That's really interesting. And if you I'm sorry to interrupt you, Conrad, but if you take a look at what's happened to the way wrestling is presented today,
yes,
I'm not convinced that's not still a major contributing factor to some of the, I'll call it, lack of psychology and overemphasis on the visual dynamic. And that actually makes a great deal of sense. Not from a storytelling perspective, but from a business perspective, it does.
Not to sound like an old school guy, but that's also a reason I think that selling is sometimes not as important. That's viewed as the old way, because if you're a video gamer, one of the guys isn't really selling. I mean, he's going to try to get to his feet as fast as he can, and now let's hit another finishing maneuver. I'm saying that to say it's clear that Kenny Omega and Will Ospreay, they've been pretty vocal about their love of video games and how they've tried to cater some of their entrances and their gear and their moves, and they're heavily influenced by video games. But that wasn't unique to just wrestlers. Eric, I don't know that you've ever paid any attention to this, but a lot of the football players today who just got drafted and became multimillionaires and are about to start their season, they lived and died football based on their video games. They learned the X's and O's of what plays work and what doesn't work and what to do when. They fell in love with the video game, and that inspired them to play football. And now they're most excited about, what is my rating in Madden? I want to play as myself in the game. A lot of these guys pursued their dream to be professional football players, Eric, because they wanted to be playable characters in Madden. That's a real story.
No, and it's understandable. It's human nature, number one, and it's good business. It can be number two, because if you think about it, if you're a wide receiver or running back, or you've got an opportunity to find yourself in the end zone on a regular basis, if you're that good, then man, you don't have a signature move in the NFL like you do in professional wrestling, but you certainly have a signature end zone dance.
There you go.
That could become part of it. So I would like to see the correlation behind the, just the prevalence of the end zone activity, so to speak, and dance, as it relates to the success and growth of NFL video games. There's probably a similar correlation between that and what's happened to the way wrestling matches are being presented, and the influence, the common denominator being the influence of video games on those athletes.
Doom Rules is with us here live, and he says, being a late bloomer to pro wrestling, I discovered WCW in 1999 in my preteens. It's thanks to Revenge that I learned to appreciate it. The guy became a wrestling fan, and he's here with us here live right now on YouTube because of the video game way back when. How cool is that?
It's pretty awesome. Pretty awesome.
Chris Lynch is with us here live, Eric, and he wants to know, was there any pushback from anyone in corporate having NWO in the title of WCW/NWO Revenge, since that wasn't an actual entity?
No, zero. At that time, nobody was really, corporately, very few people paid any attention to WCW. 97, 98, the only time that they would pay attention to WCW is when we were at the Omni, or and they wanted tickets for their friends and their family. But operationally, up until the middle of 1998, July, August of 1998, I had so much autonomy that I don't think anybody corporately even recognized what we were doing in terms of the NWO game.
I do want to ask you about the video game executive known as Alfred R. Kahn, Al Kahn, AKI. He is getting a lot of praise in our live chat. He's sort of he's the big deal in pro wrestling games back then, certainly in the space. And WCW did business with him, but I guess he had a lot of gravitas and he could be a character. He's somebody that I have to admit I'm not super familiar with. Any experience dealing with Al? What was your relationship?
Yeah, I had several meetings with Al Kahn. I always enjoyed him. He could have been a wrestler, in another lifetime. He had that big kind of over-the-top personality. He was a character, and he was really successful and a very, very smart man.
Ultimately, is it just the financials that get in the way and keep you from continuing to do business with him, or why did that deal come to an end?
Probably just the financials. At the end of the day, I had to make decisions that were in the best interest of the bottom line, regardless of how I felt about somebody, whether I liked him or disliked him. Didn't really matter. What mattered is the money. What was the best for the bottom line and the future growth of the company? It wasn't just, what benefits me today. It's okay, does this deal benefit us today, and what's the forecast going into the future? And I had to bet on growth. I still would do the same thing today. You have to bet on growth, and that's what we did.
I wanted to ask you, Eric, about someone who's mentioned in one of these press releases. It says the joint announcement was made today by WCW's newly appointed manager of licensing, Casey Collins. I've never spent any time talking about Casey Collins. What can you tell us about Casey?
I like Casey a lot. I only worked with him for a short period of time. I didn't have a lot of experience working with Casey. I think Casey went on to in fact, I know he did. Casey Collins went on and worked for WWE. In the early 2000s. For all I know, he's still there. But he was a really talented young man. He brought a fresh He brought a fresh perspective to WCW. He wasn't part of the old guard, so to speak, the residual Crockett family influence that was still pretty pervasive in WCW well into the mid-90s. Casey was from outside of wrestling and brought a lot of new ideas, a tremendous amount of energy. He was great with people, and he was a good negotiator. I thought very highly of him. And he was fun to hang out with. He was an upbeat personality.
He's got to be a fun guy to hang out with, because not only did he do WCW, he was with Lucasfilms and then WWE. You started shaking your head, guy. You got any Casey Collins knowledge you can drop on us?
I don't, other than, as Eric was talking about, what he subsequently went on to do. That was something I remember looking at several years ago doing the first book, and I think that kind of says it all, right? Not only was he obviously successful in what he did at WCW, but to have that longevity with WWE, I think that says a lot about his impact.
Well, somebody else who has a lot to do with impact is our sponsor today, Cash App. And I got to tell you, I've been paid on Cash App with some interesting notes. And if you've ever find yourself in the need to send some money, can I recommend Cash App for you? What I love most of all is that Cash App keeps our money safe. I'm a big believer in their product. And if you want to feel safe and in control from fraud and in control, that's exactly what you can expect with Cash App. And when you get the Cash App card, not only do you get tons of access and perks and benefits, like early access to nationwide concert pre-sales and discounts, but you also have the extra security with the power to instantly lock or unlock your card right from your phone with just a tap. You see, with Cash App, you spend, save, and live your life knowing your money is right where you left it. With advanced built-in security, protections you can count on, and help when you need it, spend with peace of mind today and order a Cash App card in the app or at cash.app/card. You see, the advanced security being built in means that it's going to keep your money safe and your personal info stays personal, and you're going to get the help right when you need it. Your security deserves to be a priority, and Cash App treats it that way. So with Security Lock, Cash App requires a successful Face ID or a biometric authentication to access your account. It's like your money is being protected by your own personal bodyguard, even if you accidentally leave your phone unlocked or someone gains access to it without your knowledge. Plus, if you're about to send money to someone and Cash App notices something looks a bit off, maybe you're falling victim to a scam, they're going to send you a warning before the money's sent in to make you take a second, confirm that everything looks right. I'm a big believer in Cash App. I know you will be too. And right now, for a limited time, new Cash App customers can use our exclusive code to earn some additional cash for real. Just download the Cash App, use our exclusive referral code, 83 weeks in your profile, and send $5 to a friend within 14 days. And then you'll get $10 dropped right into your account. Terms apply. That's money. That's Cash App. Cash App is a financial services platform, not a bank. Banking services provided by Cash App's bank partners. Prepaid debit cards issued by Sutton Bank, member FDIC. Instant discounts provided by Cash App, a Block Inc. brand. Visit cash.app/legal/podcast for full disclosures. So we are live here, and we've got some questions from our live studio audience. Let's jump to some of these. ELP 3035, Eric, wants to know, did WCW profit from the games? Was there ever a correlation between the games and ratings? Did the bad games hurt the brand? Thanks for the memory. So let's break that down. Do you remember, Eric, that revenues for the game were higher when ratings were higher? I guess that makes sense. If there's a bigger audience, maybe there's more to sell. Was there a correlation that you saw, or was it a totally different algorithm?
No, I mean, they're I guess indirectly associated. There's not a direct connection between ratings and revenue, unfortunately, at least at that time. But obviously, the more people are watching, the bigger your market is. The bigger your market is, the higher percentage of those viewers you're going to activate as consumers. So there's obviously a very strong indirect correlation. But the revenues for the games didn't necessarily correlate up and down. For example, during the NFL, Monday Night Football, guess what happens to Monday Night Nitro and Monday Night Raw? We take a pretty good sized dip. That dip isn't reflected necessarily in retail sales because it comes back usually at the end of the NBA season, right around May or June. It still comes back, not to its peak, but it comes back. Your peak season is for ratings tends to be post really January, February, March, April. By the time you get into April, you're getting the NBA playoffs. So your ratings start to taper down, but that doesn't necessarily mean that your revenue does, at least relative to licensing. So indirectly, yes. Directly, not really.
Guy, I want to ask you, based on the research that you've seen, what sort of splits were there? I mean, I know we're talking about the different deals that WCW had with these different manufacturers, and Eric talked about the advance he got, because that's really what it was. It was a $5 million advance. I guess the question I have is, would they have gotten there anyway? Would they have exceeded that with THQ? What can you tell us about the way those royalties worked for WCW company to company? Did each contract net a better royalty, if you will?
Well, it's funny you say that, because if you really want to see this at a granular level, if you look in the new book, Beyond Nitro, and you read the chapter which is covering the subject, you'll actually see the precise language in the licensing agreement. So if you want to know exactly how much WCW would be remitted per sale of the games, that's in there for you. And also there's information on how that changed over time, if that answers your question. But I think if I could add something on to the last question as well, in terms of the relationship between the viewership figures or the ratings and the video games, it's quite interesting. We've talked a lot about the really pivotal game that WCW NWO Revenge came out the day that Nitro beat Raw for the last time. October 26th, 1998. That was the day that the game came out. That was the day after Halloween Havoc, where, if you remember, they showed the Goldberg and Page match again on TV. So quite interesting that those two dates coincided. And although we could never, it would never be feasible to make this correlation, I'm not pretending to, but it's just interesting that in the couple of months after the release of that game, which was a big deal, of course, Nitro, even though it wasn't beating Raw on a weekly basis, was actually registering its highest ever numbers during the Monday Night Wars. If you go back and look at January of '99, for example, you'll see sky high viewership. It's just that Raw was doing a little bit better. And finally, I'll just add as well that one of the things I talk about in the book is, throughout the Nitro era, one of the data points that WCW consistently cited to the media in relation to their audience was that 24% of the Nitro audience was age 17 or younger. 12 to 17 was the specific breakdown. So with that being said, naturally, given the typical target audience for video games, one could make the assumption that a fairly significant part of the Nitro audience week to week were also playing these games, given that the percentage was so high. So hopefully that answers your question.
It does answer my question. Be sure to check out Guy's book if you haven't already at guyevansbooks.com. Use our promo code 83weeks and learn a little bit more about the granular details of these contracts. We got lots of comments like, how did we go from the beauty of WCW mayhem to the trash of backstage assault? Well, I think we kind of touched on that. Smelly Butler says, as a 40-year-old in 2025 who played all of them, WCW NWO Revenge on 64 was the greatest wrestling game ever made. I hear that almost everywhere I go, that it's that or No Mercy. Don't you hear that, Guy?
I do, and this gives me the opportunity to shout someone out who was absolutely pivotal in the development of these games, and someone who helped me a lot with both books in terms of understanding all this. A guy by the name of Sanders Keel, who was a producer for THQ and traveled to a lot of the Nitro events and even went to some of the syndicated tapings, I believe, in Orlando to take photos of the different wrestlers and learn about their moves and their characters and so forth. But he achieved something, and it wasn't only him, of course, but I think it's safe to say he was heavily involved in the process. He and others achieved something which I think is really notable, which is that they were wrestling fans and WCW fans and followed the product very, very closely and included in the games all of the details that the hardcore fan would want to see in the games, but equally made something that appealed to the masses as well, right? And that I would imagine being able to do both of those things is quite a difficult task, right? They were able to to give you something. If you knew, every single move that every single WCW wrestler does, and every sort of idiosyncrasy and intricacy of their character, they were able to show you that in the game while still making something that the non-fan could walk into the room and say, that looks cool. And, there's been many attempts to sort of replicate that formula, I think, over the years in the arena of video games, and too often it seems like they kind of sway more to one end or the other. So if people are interested in learning even more about the development of the game, if you look at go online and look for some interviews with Sanders Keel, just an extremely nice person, very generous with all the information he gave me, and just a wealth of knowledge on this stuff as well.
Well, we greatly appreciate you showing up and hanging out with us today for a part of our discussion about the video games. I think we'll close with this from C. Neil X, who says the THQ WCW games on Nintendo 64 revolutionized wrestling video games the same way the NWO revolutionized the wrestling business. Absolute game changers. I couldn't agree more. And I know some of you were disappointed that we talked about the business of the video games, but Eric, I think the next time you and I get together, we may have to break out some simulators. I say you and I play some of these old video games, and I'll even try to put you over, even though I know I could Goldberg you, no problem.
Let's do that. That would actually be fun. It'd be a brand new experience for me. You can pop my video game cherry, so to speak.
Okay. On that note, go check out Guy's book. Use the promo code 83weeks at GuyEvansBooks.com. And we greatly appreciate all of you guys hanging out with us as we talked about the WCW video games. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the notifications bell. When I can pin Eric down, we're going to do it in 8-bit characters live at 83weeks.com. So long, everybody.